Are we up? Okay. So is most easily, what I want to say, sorry, the noise got to me for a second. What we're going to get into the 6th chapter seems to be somewhat anachronistic in that we switch the topic of conversation. And so whenever there's a change in the theme or what's being dealt with in the text, it's going to give us the most elaborate and comprehensive look at what most people think of when they hear about yoga. Focus. Okay? You came all the way down here? Focus. The 6th chapter is going to give us the most comprehensive look at what most people would think of when they think of yoga. So the word yoga is used hundreds of times in the Gita, and it's used as a verb, it's used as a noun. Yoga-ing, yoga, having achieved yoga, and it's used in a wide variety of contexts to mean any number of different things. But we have sort of a pre-existing idea of what yoga means. And I don't mean the Indian-styled gymnastics, that it's kind of the boilerplate idea. Like when you see yoga on a sign in a strip mall, you understand exactly what's going on inside there. There's some Indian gymnastic, calisthenic type body weight exercises going on in there. Everybody knows that. I don't mean that. I mean when people think of yoga and they're reading about yoga in a multi-thousand-year-old text, your average intelligent person would think that yoga is referring to meditation and living apart from the mass of people and doing pranayama, doing some breathing exercises, and performing some austerities, and so on and so forth. I think that would be a reasonable... You guys are jamming me up here. You're like crushing me into the tiny little space. I feel overly contained. Thank you. Yeah, it's okay. No problem. I think any reasonably intelligent person, if they knew that they were dealing with an ancient text and it was using the term yoga, they would think meditation, quietude, Zen, that kind of stuff. That most elaborately gets treated in this 6th chapter. And like I said, there's no clear reason for Krishna to get into this. So what I always do is I'll look back at the previous chapter and I'll see, because one way to deal with a sacred text, and I think the Bible to some extent is like this, not maybe the 3 synoptic gospels and the New Testament, which actually has a chronology to it. There's 3 people, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They each tell the story of Jesus. There's some differences in their storytelling. It's themed like Mark was used as a source for Matthew and Luke, so he was first. Then there's the Q theory, the Quellen theory, that there was another source which had been lost, because you can find stuff that's common to Matthew and Luke, but that's not in Mark. So they figure there must be another older source that's been lost to time. That's kind of fallen by the wayside. But anyway, for a long time, with biblical scholarship, that was the case. Then you got John, which seems to have been written much later, because it tells a totally anachronistic story that's completely different than what you get from the 3 what are called synoptic gospels, because they tell the same story. And then you get Paul and his story, and you get his preaching to people, and the people they were preaching to in Turkey and Syria, and you got letters going back and forth, and James and other apostles get a chance to weigh in and give their thoughts on different subjects, and you get the story of the early church and the converting of the Romans and the early initial outreach that was done by the church just after the time of Jesus, mainly going eastward, going into Syria and Turkey and like that. Does that make sense? So that's you go into the Old Testament, the Hebrew Torah, it's just fantastical It's much harder to trace out any clean line of congruence. I mean, certainly you start off with Genesis and some creation story and a cosmology of sorts, but man, it's like, it's like, there's like lots of twists and turns. It's way more difficult to find some just clean chronology in that text. So a lot of people who are just familiar with the Bible or with the really Western texts, the Quran also has kind of some major shifts that take place as Muhammad moves from being a prophet to being a warlord. You see it's like the poetry that's at the beginning of the Quran, as you get towards the end, it becomes just much more like almost like Leviticus or like rules, rule after rule after rule. Don't bother the prophet when walking into his chambers. Say what you have to say and then leave. Stuff like that. Like it becomes way more like just a rule book to follow, and way less the prophetic, inspirational, really poems in Arabic of the earlier chapters of the Quran. Anyway, when you look at these three texts, the Quran and the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, you find that they're a bit more sporadic. They're a bit more thrown together. They're a collection of various texts and various writers and various peoples that then come together. The exception being, of course, the Quran. But the New Testament and the Old Testament follow a similar path. It's the writing of the early followers. And so there's a book of Daniel. There's a book of Isaiah in the Hebrew Torah. And then you have like James and Paul's letters to the Romans and instructions to the Romans. And so you find it's just different people who were part of the early church, and they had their thing they wanted to write down, and it all got thrown together and voted on, and it became what you know it as. You follow? Does that make sense? So, at least for people familiar with Western spirituality, in these major forms, the religion of 5 billion people of the world, there's not such a premium placed on things making sense and logically progressing from one subject to another. Therefore, it's quite common for people to just open the Bible up to a verse, read the verse, and try to derive meaning from it. Almost like they're throwing a tarot, or they're, doing the I Ching or something like that. It's just, they open the text up, and it's a book of wisdom sayings that don't require any necessary rhyme or reason tying them together. And so you've probably all done this at some point, with the Bible being the religion of your, automatically the religion of your birth, or the Torah. I mean, I doubt you guys did this because you were raised in practically atheist homes, but for most people, in the U.S., whatever the percentage is that's Christian in the U.S., in difficult times, they might just open. That's why the book is, the Bible's there in most hotel rooms, right? They just kind of open it up on a dark night when you're having some difficulty, a dark night of the soul, and you look for some inspiration. And you find Christian preachers also participating in this. They'll just have a verse, and they'll just speak from that verse. A lot of times sans the context. So you could do the same thing with the Gita. You could, when you find a massive shift in themes, you could just be like, that's natural. I'm used to that. I'm used to massive shifts in themes when I look at a text. And I'm not really smart, and so I just go with the flow, and I listen to an hour-long class. I'm like, oh yeah, you said this. You'll pick out one sentence, and that's what you take with you. People do that with yoga classes. People do that with everything. I mean, the world is filled with people who are very, very stupefied in the sense that they have not learned the lost art and science of how to focus and control their minds and stay on point. And so they're like little kids who maybe remember something, like, almost like somebody with attention deficit, almost like somebody with short-term memory loss. You're like, they're lucky if they can remember one or two sentences that you said to them 5 minutes later. Right? So, if that's what you are, if you got that like sort of toddler level of an ability to focus, then the best you can do is you open up the text and you read a verse, because that's about as long as your attention span lasts for. And so you could look at the Gita like that. Because the Gita is spoken by one person and it's one conversation, just prima facie, you should expect there to be more coherence in the text. Whereas in the New Testament, the Old Testament, you're looking at dozens of different people talking. And so it makes much more sense that they would each switch gears when they get up on the mic. You'll even find just actual disagreements in both the Hebrew and the Christian Bible. You'll find actual disagreements between the different saints in the text. Paul and James don't get along, and Paul and the rest of the apostles, to some extent, don't get along. And there's a huge difference. You can find blood sacrifices in the early portion of the Hebrew Bible, and then you find admonitions against blood sacrifices in the later tradition, in the same text, like in Hosea, for instance. So we shouldn't expect that in the Gita, given that it's one conversation. If you take it at face value, you should expect it to be more coherence, because Krishna's having a 1 hour long conversation with Arjuna on the battlefield, and should be more consistent if Krishna's, certainly if he's God and omniscient, he should be able to maintain coherence for an hour. And so I think, looking at the stated context of the book, there should be more of an expectation of coherence, and provided you have the ability to focus and pay attention for more than 30 seconds, you should look for such things. You should be interested in such things. So this 6th chapter is going to get into a classical yoga, and it's natural to ask, well, why? Why did we jump into that? Where's that coming from? And so what I usually do is I'll look back a couple of verses, and I'll look at what transpired just prior to the shift to see if there was maybe a little bit of a, what do they call it? It's a literary term. It's used foreshadowing. Also, there's another term that's used in movie writing, script writing. It's more specific than foreshadowing. Anyway, foreshadowing we'll have to do for today. But if you watch a movie, things will happen in the movie that seem unnecessary, or they seem random. But then later on, those things become quite important. And so if you watch the movie a second time, or if you watch the director's cut with the director's commentary, then they'll tell you, oh, see, I put that there. Because see, and you kind of put it all together. There'll be a shot of a table and a key on the table, and it will seem unnecessary. But then eventually, later on, an hour later in the movie, that key opens the vault that, saves the princess or whatever's going on in the movie. So if you go back, in my book, it's text 27 and 28 of chapter 5, page 258 in my book, although your book may be ordered a little differently, but it'll be around page 258. Sparsha kritva bahir bahyani. So chakshush chaivantare bruvihi. Having shut out external stimuli and closing the eyes and focusing on the eyebrow, which would be, if you close the eyes, well, you're not closing the eyes. Excuse me. You're focusing the eyes in between the eyebrows. So bruva is the eyebrow, and chakshush is the eye. So if you focus the eye on the eyebrow, what would you do? Focus your eyes on your eyebrow right now. See that? You're kind of rolling your eyes back in your head. Sometimes I'll also say you focus the eyes on the tip of the nose. So that would be this. You're rolling your eyes inwards. You're rolling your eyes upwards. Or what this really means is you're focusing, it just says on the eyebrows, but what it really means is you focus right in between the eyebrow. So you're rolling upwards and inwards to here, or you're rolling downwards and inwards to here. And it's a physical manifestation of your turning inwards instead of looking outward. So you keep external things outside. Literally it says you keep external things like touch, etc. outside, and you focus the sight on the space between the eyebrows. Although it just says the eyebrows, but a lot of times in these texts they'll assume a certain familiarity with the concepts being mentioned. And then prana apanao samao kritva. You make the inward and the outward breath equal. Nostrils flow very evenly. Yatendriya mano buddhi. You control your senses, mind, and intelligence. Muni moksha prayana. The sage is looking for liberation. He's holding liberation as the highest goal. Vigata icha baya krodha. You're letting go of and you're ending desire, fear, and anger. Ya sada mukta sa eva. Ya sada mukta eva saha. One who is always like this, he is liberated. So this is a description of a physicalizing of the practice of living in a detached way, which was introduced in the last chapter. The last chapter introduced the idea of knowledge, that you're a soul, that knowledge is illuminating like the sun. It introduced the idea that you could live in this world but not be of it. You could do your duty without being attached. It explained that knowledge would result in you seeing all living beings equally, that you would become indifferent to heat and cold, pleasure and pain, victory and defeat, that you would become self-situated, you'd find your light within, your happiness within, your joy within. And then a physicalizing of how you might go about practicing that is being introduced here. Did you follow that? So there's a goal of a certain state of consciousness, and that there's some behavioral elements to that, but it's very cognitive. It's very much about the way you look at the world. There were some behavioral elements, but it was a lot of time was spent on the cognitive aspects of self-realization. And now there's a physicalizing of this into what the behavior pattern of somebody who wanted to achieve self-realization or someone who had achieved self-realization. It's both descriptive and prescriptive. It's prescriptive because it tells you what to do. It's descriptive because it describes what the person who's adept in spirituality is behaving like. But we've made a move from a cognitive aspect to a behavioral aspect, which is critical. Behaviorism did not long endure in psychology because we have thoughts, and those thoughts a lot of times drive our actions. And it's very difficult to modify someone's behavior without modifying their thought patterns. It's easier with animals because they have much more limited intelligence than we do. If you want to understand that animals have much more limited intelligence, you can do brain scans of them, but you can also look at language amongst animals and the lack of recursion in their primitive barkings and so on and so forth. You can compare that to the ability to speak with recursion and to link thoughts together in deeper and deeper ways. I went to the store on my birthday to get this for this person at this time. We can link concepts together, very specific in what we're talking about. It's called recursion in language. And you look at even a 5-year-old's ability to do that compared to any other animal, non-human animal on the planet, and we're in a whole different league. So behaviorism works for animals. You know, you want your dog to stop going to the bathroom on your carpet, you smack him around. There was a new tool I saw on Instagram or something. It's like a little button. You press it and it lets out like a super gnarly, piercing sound that your dog can hear. So anytime your dog does something you don't want to do, you just press the button. And when your dog stops, you let go of the button. And like it's a very humane way to go about, training your animal. And it's humane because you can't hear the sound. But if you're the dog, it's probably freaking you out like anything because they're ultra sensitive to sound. This is probably totally like, giving you post-traumatic stress disorder, which is exactly what you want to do with an animal when you're training it. You give it post-traumatic stress disorder, so it's afraid to commit a crime and disobey you and, hold its bladder for hours till you get home or pees in the bathtub because it's so freaked out about peeing in the carpet because you broke its eardrums every time it did, And so such things are just fine for animals, whereas their behavior is, really all we're concerned with. With human beings, that was found to be sorely lacking. And so the behaviorism of Skinner in the 50s gave way to humanism and cognitive behavioral therapy in the 60s, which has remained constant because it addresses both our behavior as well as our thought processes. So you see the same thing here. We dealt with some of the cognitive aspects of self-realization, which is the result of knowledge, which was introduced as being the goal in the 5th chapter, and then that's given way now to some physical processes which will result in that state of self-realization. And also it gives you some things you could look at, so if you found a sage looking at his eyebrows all day, that would be a good thing. Of course, you've got to balance that with the statements that you should do your duty. So anyway, that's what happens just before we segue into the 6th chapter. And so if you have the ability to pay attention for more than 5 minutes and learn more than one small thing in a class or 2 things, this information will be valuable because you'll be able to use it as a bit of a roadmap to understand the next chapter and how it fits coherently together with the last chapter. Do you follow that? Okay. So now, moving into the 6th chapter. This is one who is unattached to the fruits of his work and who works as he's obligated is in the renounced order of life, and he's the true mystic, not he who lights no fire and performs no duty. Well, that seems to be a scathing critique of the statement that was just made before that you got to do pranayama, right? You see that? That's a tempering of the previous statement, so that you won't get the idea that you should simply retire from life. Lighting no fire, I dealt with that elaborately last week, if your memory goes back an entire week. And so performing no duty, it's pretty simple and straightforward. If you retire from life and run away and live in the forests or caves or mountains or wherever you go to when your girlfriend or boyfriend breaks up with you, that's not considered to be very meritorious in Krishna's worldview. Rather, you should act as you're obliged. Of course, figuring out what your duty is another conversation, but you should do your duty, and then if you do your duty and you do it equipoised in victory or defeat and gain or loss and happiness or distress, that is considered to be a symptom of someone who's self-realized, and it's also prescriptive. It's how you become self-realized. A lot of times we like to think about humility or detachment as being just things you either have or you don't. So we sit around and we mope until we finally get sick of moping, and then we move on. This is usually how people deal with adversity in life. They grovel and mope and have a pity party and bitch and moan and complain as much as they possibly can in a massive fit of pathos-induced narcissism. And then finally, at some point, they get sick of doing that, and they begin to move forward. There's a much healthier way to grieve. There's a much healthier way to process. It doesn't involve just turning away from your feelings or your emotions, but does involve examining them and looking for the lessons to learn, and not indulging until you get sick of, where you are, and then moving on. And so you can take a way more proactive approach to grieving, which I'm not going to get into in extreme detail right now, but by reliving the events, by thinking them through, by speaking about them with somebody who's not stuck in the mud the same way you are, and by allowing yourself to see what you had to learn from that lesson and how you got yourself into that situation in the first place, and being willing to move forward and being courageous enough to move forward, you can turn that frown upside down, and you can turn adversity and loss into something beneficial, such that nothing bad can ever really happen to you because you always land on your feet like a cat. You can develop cat-like cognitive reflexes where whatever life throws at you, including old age, disease, and death, you can masterfully process and use it to become a better person and grow closer to divinity. Or you can eat ice cream and complain. Flip a coin or something. So, I don't know how I got into the grieving thing. Was that just a full tangent? Or was there some method to the madness?
You were talking about how most people respond to adversity. You were talking about being equipoised.
Yeah, thank you.
Behavioral.
What was it, Varungi?
Cognitive and behavioral.
Yeah,
we were
okay.
talking about that.
Thank you. Yeah. So, thank you both. At least I got two people paying attention, but I know where the rest of you were at. Anyway, I'm in the same boat with you. I couldn't keep my train of thought either. So being equipoised and gain, loss, victory, defeat, being focused on your duty, a lot of people fall apart at the seams in difficult times. And so Krishna's definitely not feeling that. That doesn't mean you have to ignore how you feel, but it does mean that a self-realized person or a person pursuing self-realization will have to adopt more progressive means of dealing with adversity than just wallowing and being paralyzed by it. And so, not he who lights no fire performs no duty. I kind of springboard off of that to look at what we find happening in this world a lot of times, where people get paralyzed and don't do their duty. And usually they got like a great excuse, like something bad happened. Some guy I just met didn't look at me twice, and so now I'm like at a, cry all day and write about it on Instagram. Okay. What is called renunciation? Sannyas. The last verse said the real sannyasi does his duty and is equipoised. So what's called sannyas, renunciation? You should know to be the same as yoga. Well, we did that already, right? So in some ways, he's wrapping up what he dealt with at the beginning of the 5th chapter, where he contrasted these two terms, sannyas and yoga. He then segued out of that, dealt with a number of different concepts in beautiful verses, but because Krishna makes sense, and he's smart, and he can hold his train of thought for more than 5 seconds, Krishna then, an entire chapter later, and remember, the chapter divisions came much later than the Gita. The Gita was divided into thematic chapters much later than the original text. And so Krishna manages to roll back around to the terms sannyas and yoga, renunciation versus doing your duty, but having a renounced attitude towards the results, simply put. And so he rolls back around and says what's called sannyas, you should know to be the same as yoga. Or linking oneself with the Supreme. Yoga indicates union. I mentioned that yoga was used in a variety of contexts in the Gita, and I didn't elaborate on that further when I initially introduced it. But yoga means union. So as soon as you say union, the next natural question that you would ask is what?
Union with what?
Yeah. I'd say there's even a prior question to union with what? What two things are being united? You're assuming that you know the first thing, but that may not be the case. As soon as you speak of a union like the United States of America, what's being united? States. You follow? Where are they located? They're located in the Americas. And they're these states. They have their own individual identity, but they become united in some context. In what context? Well, that's a big subject. States have laws. States have police forces. States run themselves. Like one of the governors, I can't remember which state it is, he's like, if Biden demands a national lockdown, we're not doing it. And you know what the president can do to force a national lockdown for a state that doesn't want to do it? I think pretty much nothing. I don't think the president gets to send a National Guard into a state without being welcomed by the governor. I'm not aware of that being done. Or the president overrules the governor and the legislative senate of a state, the governing body of a state. I'm not aware of that ever being done. It may have happened. It probably happened 150 years ago. It was called the Civil War. But I don't think that happens. Usually the mayor of a city, the governor of a state has to invite the National Guard in. Trump wanted to send the National Guard for a bunch of things. And the guys who were in charge of the Department of Defense shined him, said no dice. And he just got rid of them recently. He fired a couple of them recently. Just if you're up on politics, which I am for 1 week a year. So, 1 week a decade. Yeah, the states have their own independent existence. There's Fed law, but then there's state law. Like murder is a state law. If you commit murder in multiple states, then it becomes a federal crime. There's a whole thing. You got to cross state lines in order for it to become a Fed charge. If it's in your state, they can't really. It's a state crime. You got to cross. That's why when they're smuggling or something like that, they're sex trafficking across state lines. Then it becomes a federal charge, and then it's the full weight of the federal government on you. Otherwise, it's a state crime. Whole different ballgame. Kidnapping across state lines becomes a federal crime, but within the state, it's a state crime. Even murder. Capital punishment is determined by the state, not by the Fed. Supreme Court Justice, who's got a funky name? What's his name again? Oh, God. Alito? No, come on, what's his name? Alito? Justice Alito just weighed in on how he's disturbed that we're not letting states determine what constitutes, if men are allowed to marry or women and women are allowed to marry. There's kind of a pushback against that whole, homosexual people can get married. There's a pushback on that today. He issued a dissenting opinion today. And they have a pretty big, conservative majority in the Supreme Court now, and so it's significant. There's a whole process where how things evolve and get appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court, and then what types of cases they take and what the ramifications are, but they're substantial, because what they do is the Supreme Court judges the constitutional law. So what they do is they decide if what you're doing goes against the Constitution. If it does, then they're able to say all the states have to follow what we say, because all states have to follow the Constitution. That's why, when you get sworn in as if you get deputized in the sheriff's department or you get sworn in as a police officer, you take a vow to uphold the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, and the state Constitution. Because there's no law of the land that can ever be enacted that goes against the U.S. Constitution. So city laws have to follow state laws have to follow federal laws have to follow the Constitution. If something is deemed to be unconstitutional, then that can escalate all the way up to the Supreme Court, who judges the constitutionality of it, and then it becomes guidance or it becomes a law for the whole country if they can link it to the Constitution. And that's a whole, like, it's a very philosophical pursuit. They sometimes get really random things they weigh in on that they feel, that are required to be judged on a constitutional level. You guys following all this? All right. Sorry. As soon as you what? Someone gonna say something? What? What were you gonna say?
Nothing. I thought that maybe you wanted to know where we were again.
And what were you gonna say?
What's being united?
There you go. Good. All right. Yeah. Now I know. I'm checking you. At least in that case, I knew. The last one, I needed a lifesaver. So thank you very much, sir. What two things are being united? And it's significant because you got to determine what are those things, what constitutes them, what constitutes their union, and how significant it is. So yoga can refer to uniting oneself to truth. Yoga can refer to uniting oneself with God. Yoga can refer to uniting a horse to a chariot. The word yoga is used to indicate the union of a horse and a chariot in the Rig Veda. Yoga can be used to discuss two people uniting physically in sexual congress. Yoga can also be used to mean that. It's used as a synonym for sex in certain yogic texts as well. Any two things being united can be considered to have when planets come into or proximity to one another, or constellations come into proximity with one another, that's also called a yoga in astronomy. Because they're coming close together, and so they're connecting on some level. So the word yoga is used in a myriad of different ways to indicate always union, but what things are being united is significant. In the Gita, the word yoga is used primarily to indicate that you have achieved a certain level of self-realization, or so you've united yourself with a lesson or a teaching. It's also used to indicate you've united yourself with divinity. I think those would be the two main contexts that yoga is used in. Maybe there's other ones, but I would say that those are the main ones. Now, every chapter, I mentioned chapter titles in the Gita. The first chapter of the Gita is called Vishada Yoga, the yoga of lamentation. So every chapter in the Gita is titled this yoga, this yoga, this yoga. This chapter is called Dhyana Yoga, or the yoga of meditation. The last chapter is called Karma Sannyas Yoga, the yoga of the renunciation of action. And so each chapter has a title, and the title is a yoga. So it's a yoga. It's a way of uniting with the divine through a particular teaching. Then one who has united with the divine through that teaching, they are a yogi. One who's self-controlled is also called a yogi. One who has controlled themselves, contained themselves, is also called a yogi. That would be another way the term yoga is used. It's used to indicate a certain level of self-control, which would again be uniting yourself with a teaching, the teaching being that you should be self-controlled. You follow? So these overlap. But yogi is used to indicate one who's achieved a certain level of self-control, the ability to focus, one who's achieved a certain level of self-realization, one who's achieved a certain union with a given teaching, and one who's achieved a certain union with the divine. Those would be all different ways in which the term yoga is used. That's congruent with this idea of union. Do you guys follow this? We don't find the more secular usages of yoga in the Gita to mean war or sex or things like that. Those types of secular usages of the term yoga are not to be found in the Gita. Rather, we find more spiritual, philosophical, religious usages of the term are exclusively what the Gita is concerned with. as a philosophical and theological text. So, what is called renunciation? You should know to be the same as yoga, or linking oneself with the Supreme. O son of Pandu, for one can never become a yogi unless he renounces the desire for sense gratification. So that's interesting. To be united, you have to give up your union to your selfish desire. You follow that one? You have to give up being united to your selfish desire in order to be said to be united with something higher. Now here's where things get interesting. And it's only going to be interesting for you if you have some knowledge of what the Gita teaches. If you have no knowledge of what the Gita teaches, if you're incapable of holding on to any of the lessons that have been taught in the previous 5 chapters, then this verse won't seem to be incredibly queer. It'll seem to be totally normative. For one who is a neophyte in the Eightfold Yoga system, work is said to be the means. And for one who's already elevated in yoga, cessation of all material activities is said to be the means. Let's look at the verse in Sanskrit. I think this one deserves to be looked at in Sanskrit. Aruroksho mune yogam. For the muni or sage who desires to achieve yoga. Aruruksho is the desiderative. For the sage who is desirous of achieving yoga. Karma karnam uchate. Karma is said to be the means. Action. The word karma in Sanskrit means action, not reaction. That's how we took it as a loan word in English, but it's not what the word actually means in Sanskrit. Yoga arudhasya tasya eva. But for one who has achieved yoga, shama karanam uchate. Shama means quietude, or the cessation of work is the means. Did you guys follow that? For one who desires to achieve yoga, work is the means, but for one who's achieved yoga already, quietude, passivity is the means. Actually, have you guys ever heard of vipassana? Vipassana is a popular form of yoga meditation. There's an Indian guy named Genki. I can't remember his full name. I've drawn a blank, forgive me. And he popularized it in the 60s and 70s, and it has a whole movement attached to it, and it's a whole movement, the Vipassana movement. People do 10-day yoga, Buddhist Vipassana retreats, and they do some kind of moving meditation, or instead of just sitting and looking at a wall while your teacher like whacks you in the back of the head with a stick, like what you might do at a Zen monastery. You know, you like feel different parts of your body, and you have kind of an active counting type meditation, which is Vipassana. It comes from Vipassana in Sanskrit, which means insight. And so it's a type of meditation, a more active meditation that helps one gain insight. And then the other major type of Buddhist meditation, if you look at traditional Theravada Buddhism, the oldest form of Buddhism in the world, the other traditional form of Buddhist meditation is called shamatha. And that's where you just try to cease and desist and quiet everything down. So this same word here is used, shama. Different than sama, which means equal. Samatvam yoga uchate. Yoga is equanimity. That's where you get the word same from in English. This is shama. It's a different term. Sounds the same. Even means kind of the same thing, but totally different term with totally different etymology. Just like fortuitous sounds like fortunate, but it actually doesn't mean fortunate. It has a totally different root than fortunate. And so fortuitous means by chance, whereas fortunate means by lucky chance. But with the degradation of language, which is what happens over time, fortuitous now in most dictionaries will be by lucky chance, because they had to put irregardless in the dictionary because there's just too many stupid people. who don't know how to speak properly, and now they've also had to put irregardless as a double negative, which we don't have in English. So irregardless would mean with regard. It would be irrespective or regardless, but irregardless means with regard. I, of course, took the trouble of training myself to never say irregardless. But then they threw it in Oxford's dictionary this year, and half my life is wasted. So anyway, shama and sama sound the same, but they're actually totally different. So this is shama, quietude, passivity, tranquility is the means. What do you guys think about this verse? If you want to achieve yoga, work is the means. If you've already achieved yoga, quietude and cessation of work is the means. Did somebody unmute themselves online?
I was going to say that this seems to contradict everything Krishna's been saying for the entire Gita thus far.
Thank you, Darshan. What were you going to say?
The same thing.
You were going to say the same thing. Seems like Krishna's contradicting. What were you going to say, Mason? Oh, hey, look, I got 3 people in the room who are paying attention. That's fantastic. That's wonderful. Thought I had 2. Now I got 3. So I got 4, I guess. I still give you credit. We got 4. Oh, and Varangi's in there. There's 5 of you now. We're starting to get some numbers. We're still not a quarter of the people, but we're getting some numbers. The entire Gita, Krishna said, do your duty no matter what. To teach other people, to set an example, even after you've achieved self-realization. And now he's saying, maybe not. And so how do we resolve this? Shri, are you brave or are you foolhardy?
Probably both.
We're about to, it's not both, it's an either-or situation. If you're foolhardy, then you're stupid and brave and you're going to get yourself in trouble. And if you're brave, then you're not stupid and you're going to get an A. So you raise your hand a little too fast. If you raise your hand so fast and you don't know, I'm leaning towards foolhardy. We're not calling the election just yet, but certainly if I'm looking at the swing and the county's left, I'm going with foolhardy. Let's hear what you got to say loud so everybody can hear you.
Krishna said cessation of all material activities.
No, he did not. Prabhupada said that. That's why I went back to the Sanskrit. So you would not be able to just do that and solve the problem. Did you hear what she said today? Let's run that down. Cessation of material activities, but not spiritual activities, correct? Gotcha. So let's troubleshoot that, because that's Prabhupada's chosen way of dealing with the problem. So we can't dismiss it, because Prabhupada himself dealt with the problem for us in that way. You with me? Okay. Here's the problem with that resolution. One of my old students, he was giving class this week, and he wrote to me with a difficult thing he was dealing with in our scriptures. And he didn't want to disagree with our scriptures on a given point, but he was finding a hard time wrapping his head around it. So he wrote to me and he asked me, how would I resolve what he was dealing with? And there's a story with Prabhupada. Prabhupada was discussing a battle which took place in the Bhagavatam. And the battle gave some information about the distance between the sun and the moon, and Prabhupada extrapolated from that. And then one of Prabhupada's disciples, keep in mind here, this was 1976, so Prabhupada was 80 years old. And his disciple would have been 23. Prabhupada had been a devotee for his entire life, and his disciple had been a devotee for 3 years at this point. Was the son of a butcher in England. He was the son of a butcher, became a devotee, and had been a devotee for 3 years. He was very much young enough to be Prabhupada's grandchild, if not his great-grandchild. Depends on how you flow. If you go 20 years to a generation, he was old enough to be his great-grandchild. Let's see. 6, yeah. And otherwise, definitely old enough to be his grandchild. You follow me? Prabhupada had a kid by the time he was 20, grandkids in his 40s, and then great-grandkids in his 60s, and this guy's growing up. So it's somewhere in there. So, his disciples said, Srila Prabhupada, you are extrapolating from this verse to say what the distance between the two planets are, but that's relative to Earth, but this battle, which is being talked about in our sacred text, did not take place on Earth. It took place in another dimension, and therefore would not tell us anything about the relative distance between the Earth and various planets. Do you follow? Prabhupada's response was to go, you're right. Please call the editors and have them change it. And that was it. It never got changed. It still reads the same in his books. But Prabhupada was cool enough with getting feedback that when somebody brought up a valid point, he was actually willing to re-edit his translation work. You follow? I appreciate Prabhupada's humility and his dedication to truth and his easygoingness and his generosity of spirit as being incredibly powerful indications of his actual level of advancement. I'm not looking for a guru who knows how to fix a radiator. I'm looking for a guru who's sworn to truth and is adept at discovering truth and recognizing truth. I'm looking for a guru who loves Krishna, not one who dots all his I's and crosses all his T's, has perfect hair or teeth, or wears his chadar just so, or has a melodious voice or something like that. So, I pointed out to this devotee that I have no problem jettisoning certain arguments from our tradition if I find that they are unpersuasive. I would look for persuasive arguments. The value of an argument is its ability to persuade a given community. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu uses a number of analogies. This is Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself that I never use. I don't use those analogies of touchstones or the completeness of the sun, the lack of diminution in the sun, because ultimately the sun is a dying star. And people don't have experiences of touchstones. And so using examples like this just confounds people and makes it more difficult to make the philosophical point you want to make. So you come up with new examples which work for people in the modern day. Madhuri was just writing a post, and I thought to help her out by giving her the phrase, keeping up with the Joneses. But then later on in this post that she sent to me to look over, it said keeping up with the Kardashians. And I was like, oh, that's everything keeping up with the Joneses. It was supposed to be more. And I realized how clever the Kardashians were, because clearly that was the predecessor, parent term that they were building off with keeping up with the Kardashians, their ridiculously world-famous reality show that catapulted them into stardom status they already enjoyed and made them billionaires instead of hundreds of millionaires. How brilliant they are. And so keeping up, if you were teaching yoga to French people, you would start teaching it in French. Even if you learned it in English, you would change and you would teach it in French. Why? Because those people speak French. And so we translate things linguistically, but we also translate things culturally over time. And there's a lot of distance between generations. We might say not much changes in a decade. You're wrong. Lots changes in a decade. So I don't know how I got to this. Oh, because I'm not favoring Prabhupada's particular line of argument. Here's why. Prabhupada's line of argument, ceasing material activities. Do we ever recommend anywhere in the Gita material activities to anybody, anywhere, at any time? No, we do not. Therefore, if the first person who wants to achieve yoga has to engage in karma, we can't understand karma to be material activities because we never recommend material activities, because how would they get to a spiritual place by engaging in material activities? They would not. So to try to dichotomize the two things as this karma is material activities and this one is spiritual activities misses the point that at no place in the Gita does Krishna ever recommend doing material things. He recommends doing your duty without attachment, whether you're self-realized or not. You follow? Therefore, I don't favor this argument. It might work for a quick pass through, but if we really want to dig in and make an argument which will stand up to some serious scrutiny, this one isn't our best bet. Did you follow that? That's why I didn't like that line of argumentation. It's not just, etymologically. It's that it doesn't work philosophically. It's not that I'm just arguing with the grammar. It's that it doesn't work philosophically. But you get credit. I mean, you gave Prabhupada's own reconciliation, so it's quite intelligent. It's good. I got, 4 minutes left? But I'm allowed to go overtime now, right? The Instagram gods, the gods of IG have favored me. And I'm allowed to go over time without getting cut off. Why don't we resolve this issue and then we'll move forward? Does anybody have an argument? Yes. Loud and proud.
Okay. I'm wondering, I could be totally wrong, but I'm wondering if, with the deeper look at this verse, Krishna's actually saying the same thing that he's...
Madhuri's making the point that maybe Krishna is just repeating what he said all along. And there is no aha moment. And so in the beginning, you're doing your activities regulated, but then the only difference is you're doing those activities regulated with a more developed consciousness. Right? Yeah. I don't think that honors the actual language of the verse. I did think of it as a possible resolution, but it's like karma is the means, shama is the means. Those two terms are contrasted with one another. And so you ignore the actual language of the verse. It's like if I would say, you have to learn to see karma and akarma in karma. Action in inaction and inaction in action. You're like, well, that's just all the same. And it's like, I don't know, man. Like you're purposely contrasting two ideas. You're saying he's got to go north and he's got to go south. And the person's like, actually they're headed in the same direction. You just have to understand south is like north. You follow? Does that make sense? Both read the Bible day and night, but he reads black while I read white. That's William Blake. Well, no, actually they're reading the same lessons, just like it's all gray. It ignores the purposeful contrast given in the verse itself, and therefore it's a poor resolution. Did you follow that? All right, anybody else? Loud.
You started the class with talking about how there are different...
You've already won. You're already better than the two of them put together, squared, because you're yelling and you're following my basic instruction. All right, keep going.
You talked about how there are different secular and spiritual definitions of yoga at the beginning of the class. Krishna is introducing a new spiritual definition of yoga.
What is that?
It's Dhyana Yoga. That's what the chapter's about. He's going to talk about Prabhupada resolves it by calling it the Eightfold Path of Yoga here. So that's a different system of self-realization than what he's been talking about.
So your resolution is to embrace the contrast and say, up until now, Krishna has been teaching us one thing, and now he's teaching us something totally different.
Yes.
Yeah, that's my resolution too. Let me wax eloquent for a few more moments, Damodar, and then I'll let you chime in. In the third chapter of the Gita, Krishna does mention that if you are atmarati and atmatushta, if you're self-satisfied, self-contented, that karma na vidyate, there is no karma for you to do. He mentions this in the 3rd chapter. He also mentions that sannyas or sankhya is every bit as good as yoga. And so although in general Krishna leans in toward doing your duty and being equipoised, occasionally in the Gita, in a couple of places, he defies a saying this is right and this is always wrong. And he gives you a couple of like red herrings and just kind of things to chew on that don't really make sense. He says if you don't do your duty, but if you don't do anything but you meditate on enjoying, then you're a hypocrite. But what if you don't do anything and you don't meditate on enjoying? You follow? So that question's left unanswered. Then there's this, there is no duty for him to perform. That question comes up also. And so I think the easiest resolution of what's being introduced here is to very simply understand that for most people you need to do your duty and be equipoised. At some point in life, maybe when you're old, or maybe if you're just made that way, you could theoretically renounce the world, go to a cave, and meditate, and that might be your path. And such people certainly exist. Such yogi-type people existed in the spiritual landscape of ancient India. And this is an homage to them. Now Krishna is going to show that that's still just a methodology which leads you to the same self-realization of loving Krishna. So the end of the chapter still takes you to a place of loving Krishna. And so both of these things become a means to an end rather than an end in themselves. But there is a time in life where you retire. There is a time in life where you let go. There is a time in life where quietude is what's supposed to happen. And although we romanticize dying on the battlefield, and Prabhupada even spoke like that, ultimately Prabhupada passed away peacefully in Vrindavan, meditating on Radha and Krishna's pastime, surrounded by his disciples doing kirtan. He ultimately went back to Vrindavan and passed away from the world. You know, it was just for a few months. But this is what our saints do. At some point, you also let go. You let go for the next generation. Many of our GBC members, those are our the people who kind of run the Hare Krishna movement at the level above me, they retire. It's like it's a younger man's game. They want to, by the time they hit 70, they want to bounce, and they want to just be able to not manage anymore. And so I think just owning this and embracing it is the cleanest resolution, demonstrating that you're still going to the same place, and that what might differentiate the two types of people are age, but also to some extent mentality. And Krishna's covering all bases, and he's going to treat a classical yoga here. So you get a classical, live in a cave, control your breath, be a celibate monk, you're not fighting on the battlefield. That works for some people. It may be appropriate for some people at certain stages of their life. I think that's what we're dealing with here. And the rest of the chapter bears it out. Krishna does in fact recommend such a type of yoga here. And so if you try to discount what he said, you run into a problem in that the whole chapter you end up having to discount, and not just a single verse. And that holds for you as well. We're almost done.
I have to direct her.
Huh?
I have to direct her.
You can wait 2 seconds. We're almost done, dude. You're like making me antsy. All right. I think that's it today. You want to comment on what I said?
Thank you, Prabhu. I had in mind also that Krishna would have said that, because even though there are very few people that do qualify as an elevated yogi, they do exist, and that's why Krishna would have said that. But I really appreciate how you elaborated on it by describing that it could be due to age, their mentality, and so on, like further classifying the type of yogi that would reach that point. So I appreciated that. Thank you.
These people existed on the spiritual landscape of ancient India, and I would argue that they exist even now. And you may have, I'll give you an example. You may have people in the Hare Krishna movement who are pujaris. They don't go out and give big classes. They worship the deity. They help our movement by doing our ritual worship and creating an attractive environment for people to come to the temple. But that's how they participate. Or they cook for devotees who are going out on the streets and doing whatever they do. And so there might be people who have all sorts of different mindsets, and they find a way to engage their God-given talents in service of a greater mission. But that doesn't mean everybody's got to have a bullhorn and a hatchet in their hand. And so there is room within our movement for different types of people. And Krishna is really covering his bases here. And the elegance and the beauty of his line of argumentation is that he explains that everybody comes to the same place. That everybody ends up ultimately loving Krishna. And that that's the highest yogi. The last verse in the chapter is, the one who loves him within their heart of hearts is the most yogad. Same yukta tamo mataha. That person is the most yogad. And so Krishna does, like this thread that I'm tracing out of continuity of what ties the Gita together, that still remains. And so it's not a full-blown divergence from what Krishna's saying. Rather, it's him arguing that you can take this staircase or that staircase, but you're going to the same place. Now, a lot of times people say, yatta matata pat, that however many different mentalities, that many different paths, but it's not quite that simple. There are all sorts of regulations that would be followed by either group of people. And so there is still a basic spiritual lifestyle. It just may get expressed slightly differently. To give an example, it's not that, you could oh my God. I'm going to take that as Krishna's sign. Hare Krishna. Good night.